Welcome, everyone, to another episode of On the Way Home. I'm your host, Michael Braithwaite, and I have the good fortune of being part of the group at Blue Door. Blue Door has been around for 42 years in York, Peel, and Durham region, doing amazing work with vulnerable people, helping people with housing, with meaningful and well-paying employment in our Construct program, and of course, getting them healthy through our Health Hub, and much, much more. If you want to check out what we're doing at Blue Door, go to www.bluedoor.ca. But let's talk about today's guests in our show. These are two trailblazing, powerful, and brilliant women, people that are doing great work. Today, I'm joined by two previous guests. I have Khulud Baig, who's the Director of Policy and Community Engagement with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, and Michele Biss, who's the National Director of the National Right to Housing Network. And so they joined me today. They are two organizations of three that have been working on and will soon put out a new group of shelter standards document for women and gender diverse people and the right to housing. And so they talk about how that all came about, the process, about the advisory board they had of 18 people who put a ton of time and really rolled up their sleeves and got their hands right into this. And it took 2 years to do. And they talk about why it's important and what it does and what the hopes are, who they hope to engage, the impact that it's going to have. And then they talk about next steps and how to get involved and how to be part of the solution. As always, when you have two brilliant people, one a lawyer, one a policy expert, that are doing this work and have been doing this work for a long time and have been involved in some of the biggest um, policy and other impactful pieces that have happened over the last 10 years in housing and homelessness, it makes for an awesome podcast. So take a listen, share. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. It was a wonderful podcast and I learned a ton. Take a listen. Khulud, Michele, thank you so much for making the time to join us on the podcast today. You're doing incredible work. We want to talk all about it. But first, before we get to that, we have to ask you the standard question we ask everyone on this podcast, and that is, what does home mean to you? You both, I think, had a shot at this already. Let's see if there's any changes, or if you go with your standard answer. Khulud, we'll start with you, then go to Michele.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. And I feel like I was just here. It feels like I was here like just a month ago or something. I know it's been longer. I think my answer will probably stay the same. It's quite reflective of the philosophy that guides the work at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, which is home is a place where you have the agency and autonomy and the safety and security to make the choices that make your life better, that make help you live life in the way that you want to live it. It's the place that offers you the dignity to do so, the safety to do so, and the agency and autonomy to do so. So that's really the philosophy of all of the work that we do at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. It's what home means to me. It's what motivates my work in all of the work that I do with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. And at the end of the day, it kind of really ties to the basic human right to housing that we talk about often and all the time, is how do we ensure that everybody has a place to live where they have security, dignity, and agency, to live in the way that they want to live.
I think that I might jump on what Khulud was saying and say I think I was here just a couple of years ago, so it's been a little bit longer for me. And I remember that I said something likely about justice and the human right to housing. But you know what? This time I think I'm going to go a little bit off script. And say we just did these workshops not so long ago. So, just a couple of weeks ago, we did these workshops with youth who had experienced eviction in both Saskatoon and in Toronto. And in one of those sessions, there was a youth who had the exercise of drawing what a world without eviction would look like. And what that young person drew was a growth chart. And they explained that to them, security of tenure, a world without evictions, a world that genuinely embraced the right to housing in Canada, looked like somewhere where they could track the growth of their kids in their home, where they could put it on a door frame, where they had that safety and security to be with their family, and for those kids to grow up knowing that they were in a safe and secure place. I think that one hit me really hard. You forget, you're so deep sometimes in policy work and human rights work that you forget why you're doing what you're doing. And I think that really brought me back to think home is where people can spread their roots and grow and be.
Love it. I love both answers. I love talk about agency, dignity, security, and just a place to be. Right. Love that. I love it. The simpler, the better. Home is love was pretty simple, but to be is even shorter. Nicely said, both of you. I'm wondering if, Michele, we'll start with you this time. Just tell us just a little bit about your journey into this work and about your organization as well, if you could, please. And then we'll go to Khulud.
Sure. So by trade, I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm sorry, I am a lawyer, but I grew up actually in very much in the legal clinic system. So I had a chance to do some work representing clients. I had a short stint within tenant duty council. I had a short stint working to represent clients who had experienced discrimination by landlords when they had, for example, been seeking a rental unit, or when they had been facing eviction based on a prohibited ground of discrimination. So I really started out representing clients. And then I got into this world of the right to housing, of human rights, of economic and social rights. And there began my great love of the human right to housing. I've had the tremendous opportunity to be part of the right to housing movement for quite some time, and was there in 2019 when we got a legislated right to housing. I was part of the civil society movement pushing for a legislated right to housing that creates the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, review panels, which Khulud and I will most certainly talk about today, which are open and written hearings, oral and written hearings, where folks can feed into what systemic barriers they're facing in terms of implementing the right to housing. So I got to be there through the creation of Canada's first right to housing legislation. And I think at the time we got the legislation back in 2019, a bunch of us looked at each other and said, oh gosh, the new right to housing legislation is such a new thing. We've got this federal housing advocate. She's going to be accepting submissions. But what if people don't know that they can make submissions? The right to housing is such a new thing for folks. So we created the National Right to Housing Network. We're a coalition, a group, a network of over 2,000 organizations and individuals who really care about implementing the right to housing. We work with government. We explain to them what it really means to implement the right to housing. We support folks in accessing those justice mechanisms of the Federal Housing Advocate, review panels, and National Housing Council. And we work very closely with incredible colleagues like Khulud.
Amazing. Thanks, Michele. And it actually seems like a long journey to get here, which is always good to listen to and remind ourselves of like how long so many people have been at it, in the work that we're doing. So for me, I kind of just in my career started off in doing advocacy nationally. My first job out of grad school was with the Native Women's Association of Canada, working on housing policy. It gave me great insight and a really quick what do you call it, like a catch up on what the housing policy landscape is like in Canada. I don't think I could have gotten a better starter job when I started with something like this. And that kind of really started off my passion for working for housing in Canada. This was um, a lot of intersections with working with Indigenous groups, but also with other marginalized groups. I moved then working more municipally, working in community development. I was working in Ottawa for a while in community development, also touched upon housing, but then other social issues as well. We talked a lot about and worked a lot on social infrastructure, and then routed back to working with an Ontario-based Indigenous organization called Keepers of the Circle, which then led into my current role with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, the quick and dirty of my work on housing. But what's really cool and interesting is the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network really started off with this national literature review on the state of homelessness among women and gender diverse people in Canada. And that was sort of one of the first opportunities for a really big group of people to come together and look at how housing is a gendered crisis and what that really means, and how are women and gender diverse people uniquely impacted by housing insecurity. And that literature review was then that then informed a national survey, which was one of the largest and first of its kind survey with women and gender diverse people all across Canada on the state of housing insecurity and homelessness. The survey produced some really great findings that then led to further organizing and further bringing together people. We had many people organized and involved from coast to coast to coast, and continue to be involved in this movement, really passionate about moving forward what housing as a human right means for women and gender diverse people. Then in 2022, as the federal housing advocate was getting appointed, we got our foot into the door and made the submissions for the two national claims on the right to housing for women and gender diverse people, and the right to housing specifically for Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirited, and gender diverse people. The claims got reviewed by the federal housing advocate and triggered a request for a review panel to be established through the National Housing Council, and that's sort of where we're at right now. So it's been a movement that has sort of built on starting from the literature review and the survey to what does it mean to nationally iterate the right to housing for women and gender diverse people, and how do we keep making the movement bigger and get more people involved in iterating this right to housing for women and gender diverse people. So that's where we're at right now.
Wow, both of you, congratulations on doing some really impactful and amazing work over the years. You've been like right at the forefront of making big change and important change happen, and it's so appreciated. And both your organizations continue to rise to the challenge. Today, we want to talk a little bit about a solutions lab project that you're working on around creating shelter standards, a shelter standards document for women and gender diverse people and the right to housing. What can you tell us about it? How did it come about, and why now?
Do you want to start, Michelle, and I can jump
Sure.
in?
Sounds great. Okay. Well, I'll start by saying, at the core of this project, and Michael, let me just say that this project, has been a 2-year project with an advisory group of 18 people. It has been included 13 focus groups, a whole number of materials we've built out. So this has been quite the undertaking. We're trying to figure out through this project, what are the barriers that women and gender diverse folks are experiencing in terms of the right to housing as they access shelters, as they live in shelters? And what is it that is preventing shelter providers from providing the support that is needed to meet the right to housing? And we came into this work with just this realization that there was a disconnect happening, I think, with people who are using shelters, with women and gender diverse folks, and then folks who are on the front line, staff at the shelters, and all around we're seeing this burnout, this distrust, this exhaustion that I think has really been exacerbated by the COVID crisis. And we're conscious as well that frontline staff, who are working in shelters, who are often from marginalized groups themselves and hold intersectional identities, are just so deeply burnt out. Interestingly, I recall we heard not long ago as well from some of our colleagues, I think at Women Shelters Canada, who said there's also an issue of burnout happening within shelter leadership across the country. So just knowing these realities, what is a set of standards that we can hold rights holders at the center of, that we can make sure we're protecting their rights while acknowledging the real genuine barriers to implementing a system that would genuinely protect those rights. So what we learned through this project, it's all about trust building. It's all about creating trust and space for people to exchange ideas in a respectful way while always holding that human rights based approach, that human right to housing. It started off by pulling together an advisory group. They've been a core part of this work moving forward. That advisory group, of course, includes people with lived experience of homelessness. It includes folks from frontline service organizations, from organizations who really understand what the experience for shelter providers is. And a lot of our work early on was about onboarding folks into the right to housing, to having a general understanding of what is it we're actually talking about when we talk about Canada's legislated right to housing. What does that mean at a practical level? Um, and then figuring out that clarity of what we were trying to do with the project, I think really helped folks figure out how involved they could be. And something that was really exciting through the project is how hands on I think many of our advisory members have been. So we went through a number of engagement sessions. We had one large session in person at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness conference back in Halifax in the fall, where we brought together folks to really brainstorm, okay, what are some of the best practices that are happening that are uplifting the right to housing, and how do we put that together with a set of legal standards under our legal requirements for the right to housing. We had a literature review. We had 13 focus groups. We built out some before and after scenarios to say, what do folks experience? What are some of the real stories we're hearing about the barriers folks are facing to access shelter? And then what does a system look like that embraces a really different kind of approach? Um, and then from that, that really gave us a story of what those real barriers people were facing were. And then we had a number of engagements to talk about what does it look like if we have a rights-based shelter. And those scenarios, I think, really were held at the core of building out the national standards. It was something that I think we held dear in our hearts as we wrote up the first drafts to think about what the realities are through the project. Khulud, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to what the standards are, what they contain.
Absolutely. So, all of this iterative process between the advisory committee, the engagements, the focus groups, the folks that got engaged along the way, through in person engagements and implementation advice, we were able to put together these standards, which went through a very robust and rigorous process. And there is, I don't remember the exact number now. I want to say there is like between 10 to 12 or less than 10.
There's seven.
There's seven. I'm
Seven.
sorry. I was in my head. I'm like, we were around 10 to 12. But
They were.
anyways, we have around seven standards that really iterate. And then there are sub standards actually to what it is that we expect shelter providers and also like governments, different levels of governments, the kind of responsibilities that are owed to all of the different people involved. And what I think is really important and critical about the standards that we've iterated is they really talk about the whole of the shelter system. So what are things that can be done in involving people with lived experience and service users to be more involved in the system? What are things that can be done in involving frontline folks and people that are providing direct services? How can they be better taken care of within the system? How can staff and leadership play better roles and be better integrated into making human right to housing possible? So it really is a whole of system approach when it comes to thinking about the standards and what can be done to ensure that people that are using shelters have their right to housing taken care of. And I think a really important thing that we also talked a lot about in our discussions is we do want to acknowledge that shelters at the end of the day don't represent the right to housing in full. And this is really where the practicality piece comes in, is what do we really mean about the right to housing when we're talking about the shelters? Because shelters are these temporary measures. They're not places where people are technically staying long term. And even when we talk about things like transitional housing, or when we talk about things like places where people are staying for 2-3 years, at the end of the day, all of shelter system in Canada is temporary, and it's not something that people stay in permanently. So when we are talking about these kind of structures, what does it mean to ensure human rights in these structures, and what does it mean for people to be able to live and access these services with dignity? That's what our standards iterate. And maybe I can talk about one that I feel is really important and close to my heart, which is around ensuring how can service users directly participate in building the environments that they're participating in. And this is one of the standards that we heard a lot about from all of the feedback that we gathered through advisory committees, through focus groups, and then through other iterative in-person processes as well, is how can we ensure that service users or people that are staying in these spaces actually have a say in what these spaces look like? Could there be lived experience advisory committees at the shelters? Can they directly participate in informing policy making at shelters? Can they directly participate in giving feedback to staff and leadership? So these are some of the really practical and real structures that the standards have recommended. And there is dimensions and aspects that really can be adopted within shelter policies right away. And it's all about how can different players within the system play an active role in ensuring the right to housing for everybody involved.
So what has the reaction been from people involved? Has it been very positive? Any surprises as you went through the process?
Or I think I would say quite positive. I think a lot more work needs to be done with the shelter standards, and it's interesting. We were reflecting a lot on the project, and where some of our gaps are, and there certainly is more we would have liked to do with this project. We would keep this project going for years if we had the capacity to. But something that I think really sat with me, I think, was just how much a process like this has been needed. Just bringing together people who are rights holders with shelter providers to have that dialogue has been just doing that process in and of itself, I think, has really led to some deep relationships and increased trust building across different organizations. And that has been a really cool outcome, I think, of the project. And something that I've noticed as well, in my day to day, I engage with a lot of government actors. And in discussing the project that we've undertaken here, I hear repeatedly from government actors how excited they are on this project, because I think government actors are conscious of their role in I work mostly with the federal government, but being the start of a lot of funding programs that then trickles down into frontline services. And I think they've had a lot of thinking about what kind of resources can they develop to really get actors outside of the government on the same page about what the human right to housing is. Because we say this, I'm going to say this again, it's I think one of the most important things we talk about at the National Right to Housing Network, and that is that the right to housing, the legislation we got in 2019, it's not just words on a page. It is real, it is true, it invokes international human rights law, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is this whole set of international human rights norms and standards. And so much of this work through the legislated right to housing is about bringing that home to people and understanding, what does that mean for government? What does that mean for rights holders? And then what does it mean for the private actors or these other actors who are just kind of sitting in between, like actors who receive government funding? So I think that has been a really, maybe not surprise for us, but maybe more of an affirmation for us of how much this kind of work of dialogue is needed for folks to be able to wrap their heads around this new way of thinking and acting within the housing sector.
Yeah, that's that's really great, actually, Michelle, that you mentioned that. And I actually would maybe go a little further and say that it's also one of the things that we touch upon in framing the shelters is also recognizing that there are multiple sectors at play here. So the way that the shelter system works is it's not just one monolithic sector. There's multiple players within the sector. There's different types of shelter services that are being offered. There's different types of lengths of stay that are offered through those services. And what does it mean to look at all of them and then apply these standards to different contexts to ensure that the human right to housing is being met there, and that people that are accessing those services feel like their right to housing is not being violated. So there is this, more than anything, is an opportunity for people from different sectors to come together on the same page and say, what does this look like if we were to implement it within our systems? And how do we better coordinate? How do we better converse with each other? How do we have better systems that ensure that these standards are being met? There's also, I think, a really important conversation around where responsibilities and duties lie. And when we talk about human right to housing, there's a very critical conversation around whose responsibility and whose duties. And we talk a lot about the responsibility of the state and obviously different levels of government to ensure that there is proper funding mechanisms available to sectors and systems to be able to function, to get the realization of right to housing going. But then there's also responsibilities. There's also, staff and leadership at shelters that have a role to play and have a really distinct role to play in all of this. It's not, I don't think the right amount of funding can set off everything. There has to be different people coming together and making conscious choices towards moving there. So when we talk about the standards, it really is an opportunity for people to come together and think about the kind of roles that they have to play in making these standards come to life.
And thank you for that. And now you also kind of spurred something in my brain. Like if I look at the city of Toronto, or if I look at the region of York, the shelter standards are set by your region, by the city, and saying, hey, if you're going to provide shelter in, have you had buy-in from, you mentioned levels of government, municipalities, say, absolutely, show me the way? Because you're quite right that quite often people will say, love the idea of the right to housing. The next question is, oh, what the heck? How do I make it real? What does that mean?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
please,
Michelle.
Khulud. No,
I was
Khulud,
gonna.
do it.
I have like a little like pressing thought on this. So I was like, I'll just put it out there. But I think this is actually a larger question around the right to housing mechanism in Canada, Michael, and how that's rolling out at different levels of government and through different like housing systems and mechanisms. Because one of the things that we are seeing is we have this federal mechanism, but it really varies like what kind of pickup we're getting in different provinces, territories, and municipalities. So there is a lot to be done, a lot of steps to be taken to really have that sort of trickle down penetration of the right to housing at different levels of government, and have that pick up at different levels of government to seriously say this is an important piece of legislation for us, and this is really critical for us in our implementation of housing programs. So when we talk about like pick up at different municipalities, the work of getting the standards done and out there is quite literally like part one, and then the implementation and pickup and how these get implemented and how many people are ready to come on the table and have a real conversation about that is part two. And what we're really hoping is that our conversations and work don't end with part one, and that we actually do get an opportunity to continue this work in different spheres and across the country, because the contexts look really different, the standards look really different across the country, and how shelters are being operated across the country can be very different as well. The capacities are very different, the resources allocated are very different. So it is really critical. I think it kind of is reflective of how the right to housing mechanism itself exists within Canada right now, where we have this mechanism federally, but the sort of awareness, the pickup, the trickle down penetration of it is very different across different regions and provinces, territories, municipalities. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's well said. And you know what, you actually, like, I was gonna say, well, what's next? You said here's step two, and doing that. What are the hopes? So going forward, like, what are the hopes with this? And how do you know if you've been successful?
Well, shall I jump on that one first, Khulud? Yeah. Okay. What are the hopes? I mean, this is a lot of long work. I think we're learning this. This has been a 2-year project, and we are now at this point where we're ready to release these standards that have been hard. It has been a long journey to get them developed. So I think now our next steps are to look at the different opportunities, the different players who are interested in picking up the standards, and are interested as well in finding the pieces that sit right with them in terms of best practices, and starting to work on the education piece of this. What is the right to housing? What does it mean for your practice? Because as Khulud was saying, we're seeing different levels of implementation in different municipalities, different provincial and territorial levels. However, something we are very excited about, that Khulud and I must talk about, is the fact that we are standing at the moment where very soon I expect we will have the very first review panel on the topic of women and gender diverse experiences of homelessness, and the government's failure to step up and create policy to end that experience of homelessness, with a particular focus on Indigenous women and Two-Spirit persons. So Khulud, I think, can speak a ton to the journey to get to this review panel. We know that the federal housing advocate has referred over the issue, and we are at the moment where we're ready, I think, to jump into review panels. I know the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network holds this work very dear. It is incredibly important, and we at the National Right to Housing Network are right there with them. I'll say that we at the National Right to Housing Network, so much of our work centers on the National Housing Strategy Act, right to housing justice mechanisms, and what the review panel, the council, and the federal housing advocate are going to do with the space that they have, and the way that rights holders are able to access those processes. Michael, I'm sure you've had some chances to talk a little bit about the financialization review panel. We just got those findings and recommendations last month. We at NRHN have been deeply involved in that process and coaching folks to engage in the process. And so now, as we go into this next review panel, a big question for us with these standards has been, how are we going to use the process of developing the standards and the content of these 7 standards we've developed to embed within the submissions that we might make to the review panel, and that we might also encourage others within our networks to make. Khulud, I don't know if you wanted to talk about the review panel process, the road to get there, because you folks are so deeply tied in that.
Yeah. It's really probably one of the biggest things on our horizon right now is how can we get folks engaged with the review panel, and how can we ensure that there is a robust, rigorous engagement from coast to coast to coast with the review panel on gender and housing. Most importantly, because this is one of the first times that such an inquiry is happening into the right to housing for women and gender diverse people. And it really is speaking to that recognition of housing being a gendered crisis and impacting women and gender diverse people uniquely. The standards can play a really critical role in informing submissions, but also, like I was saying earlier, just generating those conversations around those key issues of what are the barriers that are creating human rights violations in shelter spaces right now, and what could solutions possibly look like. I think the standards also offer folks an opportunity to offer solutions to the panel and to push for certain recommendations in specific directions. It's really cool when we're able to put such pieces of such documents or such pieces of recommendations to the public to actually take and advocate on through their experiences and through their context. So the standards offer that opportunity as well. And as well, I think at the end of the day, I really am hoping that the review panel can put a lot of attention into what is actually happening in our shelter systems and what needs to be corrected. I feel like oftentimes these spaces are perpetually functioning in crisis, and they are putting out fires, and there isn't enough opportunity to just really take a step back and be like, what do we need to do with the system as a whole? Where do we go from here? What kind of solutions are available to us? What are opportunities and directions available to us? So the standards offer that opportunity, and they offer that way for people to have those conversations and utilize the review panel as a mechanism to kind of escalate those asks and be like, this is what needs to be done, this is where we need to go. So this is, again, like a really interesting intersection that the standards are at right now. We're hoping that we can maybe get some more resources and capacity in the future to really think about what implementation can look like, and to have those critical conversations with municipalities, with provinces, with regions, with shelters and advocates, and convene those spaces. So that's always going to be something that we would be looking forward to doing as well. So the hope is that this is a document that sort of lives and is used, and gets utilized in different contexts, in different ways, in advocacy, in policy making, in shelter policy making, and having shelters themselves be utilizing them when they're setting directions for their own spaces and work.
Amazing. Well, thank you both for that. Congrats on this awesome work. You talked about when can we look forward to this being released? So where can people go check this out and find out more? That's the first question, and also a chance for both of you to talk about your organizations where people can find you and find out more, or get in contact with you if they have questions.
So the release is coming in early July. So hold on, everyone. It's coming up. Will have the standards available on the websites of all three organizations who have been driving the work on this, including the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, and the National Right to Housing Network. On the National Right to Housing Network side, our website is www.housingrights.ca. You can also find us on X, Twitter. You can find us also on LinkedIn as well as Facebook. And I'll mention as well, if you go to housingrights.ca, we have a particularly excellent newsletter. And you can find a section of our website where folks can sign up for the newsletter and catch up on news about the standards. And in fact, all of the really cool work that is happening across our partners and as well by staff at the National Right to Housing Network. Though, Khulud, you should talk about the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network.
Yes, absolutely. So, like Michele said, the standards will be available on all three of the organizations' website. You can find us at womenshomelessness.ca. The standards are going to be posted there. There's going to be a short blog and like a more accessible, shorter version. If you want the quick and easy read, it's going to be available there. We are hoping to kind of do some mobilizing work on it. So if you follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, X, Twitter, as Michele said, same for us. It's Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. Any of the work that we do, sort of mobilizing the information from our research, is always available for people to access in different mediums and formats. And then most importantly, we're going to be posting a whole bunch of stuff around the review panel that's coming up. We're waiting for the announcement from the National Housing Council on the establishment of the review panel. And once that's established, it kind of sets our work in motion. So if you're interested in participating in the review panel and just want to know what it's about and how you can get involved, you can get in touch with us at info@womenshomelessness.ca. And we can support you in any way you really need to get the work going and get a submission in to this review panel. We recognize how historic and important of an opportunity it is, and we just want to ensure that as many people as possible have the opportunity to engage with the review panel. So that's our goal and hope, and I'm really hoping that we can get in touch with folks.
Michael, before we wrap up, too, just one more thing that I just wanted to mention is, I just wanted to say here a big thank you to all the folks who were involved in this project. Although Khulud and I get the tremendous benefit of getting to talk about how exciting this was, there was an advisory group of 18 folks from across the country. There were a lot of our team members involved in this who really pulled together a pretty tremendous effort, and also a big thank you to CMHC's Solutions Lab funding program, because without the support and of CMHC, I don't think we would have been able. Well, we certainly would not have been able to do such a tremendous effort. So a big thank you to them as well.
Awesome. And thank you for that. And CMHC actually comes on this podcast to talk about their different programs. So they maybe you heard about the Solutions Lab here. I don't know. And Khulud, I felt like you were kind of looking at me through the camera when you said quick and easy read, but I do appreciate that always. Thank you both. I know you're both brilliant and busy people. This is incredibly important work. I encourage people to go to the websites, get involved, be a part of the solution. You're provided an opportunity here to make and change history. So let's do that. Thank you both so much for the work you do and continue to do. It's important and it's having an impact. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you so much for having us, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.